Tonight we'll trace propaganda from ancient Egypt, through Greece and Rome, through Napoleon, Hitler and Stalin, to today, where algorithms know you better than you know yourself, where AI creates reality itself. But here's what we're really exploring: the psychology underneath. Why does your brain crave simple narratives? Why does belonging feel so necessary? Why does repetition make things feel true? These aren't flaws. These are features of human cognition, but they make us vulnerable. Tonight you'll see the patterns. You'll understand why it worked and why it still works. So let your body relax. Let your breathing slow. Rest will come. But first, understanding. Let's begin in ancient Egypt. Close your eyes and let's explore together. Picture yourself now standing in ancient Egypt, 3,000 years before the Common Era even began. The sun rises, golden and eternal, impossibly bright, over the lush Nile Valley. A pharaoh stands, not merely as a king, not simply as a ruler, but as a living God, walking among mortals. But consider this. Pause for just a moment and truly consider. Why did millions of people, ordinary people, farmers and craftsmen, soldiers and servants, truly believe, genuinely believe, deep in their hearts, that a man, flesh and blood, was divine? The answer lies not in magic, not in supernatural forces, but in something far more powerful, far more enduring, the deliberate, methodical, brilliant construction of belief itself. Egyptian priests, those ancient masters, understood something, perhaps better than anyone who came after them in all the millennia that followed. They understood that power, true power, lasting power, exists only in the mind. Physical force can compel for a time, but belief, genuine belief, creates compliance that runs far deeper. The priests created layer upon careful layer of symbolic meaning. The towering pyramids, those impossible monuments, were not just tombs, not merely final resting places. They were messages, written in stone and mathematics, declaring to everyone who could see them the eternal nature, the unchanging reality of divine authority. Every hieroglyph carved with precision, every ritual performed at appointed times, every public ceremony carefully choreographed was designed, meticulously designed, to reinforce a single unifying idea, that the pharaoh was not like other men. The priests controlled, with remarkable care, what people saw, what people heard, what people believed was even possible. When a pharaoh appeared in public, it was never casual, never ordinary, never spontaneous. He emerged, adorned in golden headdress, holding the crook and flail, symbols that every Egyptian, from their earliest childhood, associated instinctively with divine right, with cosmic order, with the very structure of reality itself. The psychology here, when we examine it carefully, is truly profound. The human brain, as we now understand, through modern neuroscience, craves pattern, craves meaning, craves hierarchy and structure. Give people symbols, repeated consistently, over years, over lifetimes, attached carefully to powerful emotion, and you give them something more than information. You give them a complete framework for understanding their entire world. But the Egyptians, those ancient masters, understood something even deeper, even more subtle. They understood intuitively what modern psychology will later confirm, that propaganda effective propaganda, lasting propaganda, is not primarily about lies. The most effective propaganda contains truth, genuine observable truth, wrapped carefully in narrative, delivered with majesty, with grandeur, with power. The Nile did flood every year, bringing life-giving water to the desert sands. The Pharaoh did perform rituals, timed precisely to the season, down there to the cosmic cycles, and when crops flourished, when harvests were abundant, it was easy, right? So remarkably easy for people to believe, truly believe, that the divine king, through his rituals, through his connection to the gods, had made it so. This is the first principle, the foundational principle of mind control, association. Link your message firmly and repeatedly to something real, something observable, something that actually touches people's daily lives, and the message itself that becomes unshakable. It becomes not just belief, but knowledge, not just acceptance, but certainty. The Egyptians also understood the power of spectacle, of overwhelming sensory experience. The great temples, with their towering columns, their vast halls, their mysterious inner sanctums, were designed, quite deliberately, to make individual humans feel small, insignificant, overwhelmed. When you stand in such a space, your individual doubts, your personal questions seem almost irrelevant. The sheer magnitude of the structure suggests that those who built it must have known something you don't, must have possessed wisdom beyond questioning. This manipulation of physical space to create psychological effects is something we still see today in government buildings, in corporate headquarters, in places designed to make us feel a certain way. The Egyptians were simply the first masters of this art. Now, let us drift forward, gently forward, through long centuries to ancient Greece. Here, in the bright Mediterranean sun, something quite remarkable, something unprecedented, happened. Power became, at least partially, at least sometimes, about persuasion, rather than pure force. In Athens, in the bustling agora, where citizens gathered, men stood, and debated, and argued, and voted, on matters of state, democracy, fragile and new, experimental and uncertain, required an entirely different form of propaganda. Not the top-down, divine authority of Egyptian pharaohs, but something more subtle, more conversational, more apparently equal. The Greeks brilliantly invented rhetoric, the systematic study of persuasion, and with it, they invented the formal analysis of how to change minds through words alone, through logic and emotion, through structure and style. Aristotle, that great systematizer, wrote extensively about ethos, pathos, logos, character, emotion, logic. 3 pillars, 3 foundations of persuasion. But let us truly consider in why these 3 specifically, why this particular framework? Because Aristotle understood what neuroscience would confirm only millennia later with brain imaging and careful study. The human mind is not fundamentally rational, despite what we tell ourselves, despite our self-image. As logical beings, we are rationalizing. We feel first, often instantly, and then we justify with reason after the fact. A speaker with ethos, with credibility, with presence, with apparent authority, opens the door to persuasion. People lower their defenses. They become receptive when they trust the messenger. This is why throughout history, propagandists have always worked so hard to establish credibility, to seem trustworthy, even when they're lying. Then comes pathos, the emotional hook, the feeling that bypasses conscious analysis, fear, hope, anger, pride, shame, love. These are the powerful currents, the invisible forces that move human beings to action. Logic alone rarely moves anyone, but emotion is the engine of human behavior. And finally, logos, the logical framework, the rational structure that allows people to explain to themselves and to others why they feel what they feel, why they've chosen what they've chosen. The logic on it comes last, but it's essential because humans need to believe that they're rational, that their decisions make sense, even when those decisions were actually made in the emotional, unconscious part of the brain. The Greeks discovered something essential, something that remains true to this very day, that propaganda in a democracy, in any system that claims to value individual choice, must feel like freedom. People must genuinely believe that they are choosing. The art, the sophisticated art, lies in shaping the options available, the context surrounding them, the emotional landscape in which choice occurs, so that the choice you want feels natural, feels inevitable, feels like what they wanted all along. Pericles, the great Athenian leader, was perhaps the greatest master of this particular craft. His funeral oration, delivered for fallen soldiers during the Peloponnesian War, is studied even today by students of rhetoric and propaganda. He spoke eloquently of glory, of duty, of Athens itself, as an idea, as an ideal worth dying for. But notice carefully what he did not do. He did not command young men to fight. He did not threaten or coerce or demand. He inspired. He painted a vision of Athens so compelling, so beautiful, so magnificent, that young men would willingly, joyfully almost, march into battle, would choose death over dishonor. This is propaganda at its most sophisticated, its most dangerous, its most effective. When people police themselves, when they persuade themselves, when they volunteer for sacrifice, no chains are needed, no guards are necessary. The control is internal, and therefore almost impossible to escape. The Greeks also developed the concept of rhetoric as education. Young men from wealthy families, studied with sophists, learned the techniques of persuasion. This created an interesting dynamic. Everyone knew that rhetoric existed. Everyone understood that speakers were trying to persuade them, and yet good rhetoric still worked. This reveals something important about propaganda. Awareness helps, but it doesn't make you immune. Even when you know you're being persuaded, a skilled speaker can still move you, can still change your mind. The Romans, those practical conquerors, inherited Greek rhetoric, studied it carefully, mastered it thoroughly, but added something more visceral, more immediate, more overwhelming. They understood, perhaps instinctively, that words alone were not enough for controlling vast populations. The masses, the ordinary people, needed spectacle, needed bread and circuses. Panemis senses, the poet Juvenal wrote, with bitter, cynical insight, give people food and entertainment, Give them full bellies and thrilling shows, and they will not ask, will not think to ask, uncomfortable questions about power, about empire, about who truly rules and why. The Colosseum arises in your mind now, vast and brutal, magnificent and terrible. Gladiators fight with desperation, with skill, with courage, perhaps. Animals die, exotic beasts from distant lands. Blood soaks, slowly, into golden sand. The crowd, tens of thousands of Roman citizens, roar as one, a single unified voice of approval or condemnation. But consider now, consider carefully the psychology operating beneath the spectacular surface. The games were free for Roman citizens, provided by the emperor or by wealthy nobles seeking popularity. The message embedded in every thrust of the gladiator's sword, in every roar of the imported lion, was subliminal but absolutely clear. Rome is powerful. Look at the magnificent arena, the engineering marvel we have built. Rome is generous. You pay nothing for this entertainment. Rome protects you from the chaos, from the barbarians, from the violence that these controlled, ritualized, theatrical deaths represent. The violence in the arena was real. People died, genuinely died, but it was contained, controlled, given meaning through ritual. The message was clear. Violence outside Rome's control is terrifying. Violence within Rome's control is entertainment. Therefore, submit to Rome and be safe. The emperors understood, better than perhaps any rulers before them, that to control Rome, the vast sprawling empires, was to control the narrative of Rome, the story that Romans told themselves about who they were. Augustus, the first emperor, was perhaps the greatest propagandist Rome ever produced. He came to power through civil war, through violence, through conspiracy, through the brutal assassination of his adopted father, Julius Caesar. Blood soaked the streets of Rome. But Augustus did not rule as an open tyrant. He could have. He had the military power. Instead, he ruled as a restorer. Not a revolutionary, but a conservative. He claimed to be restoring the Republic, restoring peace, restoring tradition, restoring Roman virtue. He took the title Princeps, first citizen, not king, not emperor, just first among equals. The Senate remained. Elections continued. The forms of the Republic persisted. But Augustus held all real power. This was genius, a pure genius. He gave people the appearance of freedom while consolidating absolute control. He commissioned poets, the greatest poets, like Virgil, to write the Aeneid, linking Rome's destiny to the gods themselves, to cosmic fate, making Rome's empire seem not just powerful, but inevitable. Divinely ordained, he erected monuments, temples gleaming with marble, victory arches that told the story he wanted told, of peace, of prosperity, of Roman greatness. He meticulously created, the image of himself as the benevolent leader who wanted nothing at all, but Rome's greatness, and the people, exhausted by decades of brutal civil war, embraced this narrative, welcomed it, because they desperately needed, to believe it. This is another fundamental principle of propaganda, of mind control. People will even eagerly embrace the stories that give them comfort, stability, hope, and meaning. Even if somewhere deep down in the parts of themselves they don't examine, they suspect. It might not be entirely true. The need for comfort, for stability, for a coherent narrative often overwhelms the desire for truth. And propagandists throughout history have exploited this human vulnerability. As Rome fell, slowly crumbling into fragmented kingdoms, as order collapsed and chaos spread, another power rose, gradually, patiently, inevitably. The Catholic Church became over centuries the ultimate propaganda machine of the medieval world. It controlled not just belief, not just doctrine, but the very infrastructure, the entire apparatus of belief itself. Latin, the sacred language of scripture and liturgy, was understood by almost no one, except the educated clergy. The Bible itself was rare, precious, hand-copied, locked away in monasteries and cathedrals. Ordinary people could not read it, could not verify, could not check what they were told, so the Church became the interpreter, the necessary mediator between humanity and the divine. Consider the brilliance, the comprehensive genius of this system. In every village, no matter how small, a church stood with architecture designed, quite deliberately, to make humans feel small, humble, awestruck, overwhelmed. Soaring vaults reached toward heaven, stained glass windows, brilliant with color, told biblical story to an illiterate population. Images, not words, became the primary medium of communication. And every Sunday, every holy day, the priest spoke in Latin, performing ancient rituals, mysterious and powerful. The congregation could not understand the words, could not verify the interpretations, could not question the authority. They simply believed, because everyone, literally everyone they knew, believed, because the alternative was unthinkable. To doubt was to risk your immortal soul. This reveals a fundamental truth about propaganda, about social control. Isolation is its enemy. When everyone shares exactly the same information, the same worldview, the same unquestioned assumptions, control becomes almost effortless. There is no comparison, no alternative, no outside perspective to create doubt. The Church reinforced this control brilliantly through confession. In the confessional booth, behind the screen, sins were whispered, secrets revealed, weaknesses exposed, and forgiveness was granted or withheld by the priest. The priest knew the secrets of the village, the fears and desires, the hidden transgressions, the psychological vulnerabilities. Information, throughout history, has always been power. But the medieval church did something even more profound, even more effective than controlling information. It convinced people, generation after generation, that suffering was noble, that poverty was actually virtuous, that the next world, the world to come, mattered infinitely more than this one. Why work for justice here? Why fight for change, for improvement, for earthly power, when heaven awaits those who suffer patiently? This ideology, so effectively propagated through sermons and stories, through art and architecture, through the entire fabric of medieval life, kept populations largely compliant, largely accepting of terrible conditions for centuries, not through military might alone, though the Church had that, not through political power alone, though it had that too, but through a narrative so comprehensive, so totalizing, so woven into the fabric of daily life, that to question it was to question reality itself. To doubt the church was to doubt everything you knew, everything you were. And that is a terrifying thing for anyone to contemplate. But then, in 1440, in the German city of Mainz, something changed, something revolutionary. Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith and inventor, perfected the printing press with movable type. And suddenly, quite suddenly, the church's monopoly on information, on the written word, began to crack. Martin Luther, an obscure German monk, troubled by church corruption, nailed his 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg in 1517. Before the printing press, this act would have been local, containable, easily suppressed, a minor disturbance, quickly forgotten. But Luther's ideas, his criticisms, his arguments, were printed on cheap pamphlets and spread across Europe. In mere weeks, thousands of copies, then tens of thousands, circulated from hand to hand. For the first time in many centuries, competing narratives could reach ordinary people, the masses. The Protestant Reformation that tore Europe apart was many things simultaneously: a theological dispute about salvation and grace, a political uprising against papal authority, an economic transformation, redistributing church wealth, but it was also fundamentally a propaganda war, the first modern propaganda war. Catholics and Protestants, both sides, used the printing press brilliantly to spread their competing versions of truth. Woodcut images, powerful and crude, showed the Pope as the Antichrist surrounded by demons or Protestant heretics, burning in hell, tormented forever. Each side crafted careful narratives of good versus evil, of righteousness versus corruption, of truth versus lies. The people, ordinary people, for the first time in living memory, had to choose, had to evaluate competing claims, had to decide who was telling the truth. And this choice, this necessity to evaluate, to compare, to judge, planted seeds of something dangerous to all propaganda, critical thinking. When there is only one story, only one narrative, it becomes invisible, like the air you breathe. You don't question it because there's nothing to compare it to. But when stories compete, when narratives conflict, people notice, for the first time, that stories are being told, that narratives are constructed, that there are choices being made about what to emphasize, what to omit, how to frame what's happening. The frame itself becomes visible, and once you see the frame, you can never quite unsee it. This is why every authoritarian regime throughout history, from that day to this, has feared, obsessively feared, a free press. Not because journalists are necessarily heroes or paragons of virtue, but because competing narratives, multiple sources of information, fracture the illusion, the comforting illusion of inevitable truth. Of course, the Reformation didn't lead to universal enlightenment. Both sides used propaganda, used manipulation, used fear and hatred to mobilize their followers. The religious wars that followed were brutal, devastating, destroying entire regions. But something had fundamentally changed. The monopoly on narrative was broken, and it would never fully return. If you're finding this journey through the architecture of influence, through the psychology of control, worth your time, worth your attention. Consider sharing it with someone else, someone who might also benefit from understanding how minds are shaped, how beliefs are formed, how reality itself is constructed. Knowledge like this grows more valuable, exponentially more valuable, when it's shared, when it spreads, when it reaches those who need it most. Let us move forward now to revolutionary France, to the chaotic years following 1789. Napoleon Bonaparte rose from obscurity to become one of history's most consequential figures. He was many things simultaneously: military genius, political opportunist, legal reformer, empire builder. But he was also one of history's first truly modern propagandists. He understood instinctively and intellectually that in an age of newspapers, an age of increasing literacy, an age of public opinion, controlling the message required constant, deliberate, and sophisticated effort. Napoleon censored newspapers ruthlessly and systematically, but he did not simply suppress information, create blank spaces, leave silence that would raise questions. Instead, he replaced independent reporting with carefully crafted official narratives. His victories were magnified, exaggerated, transformed into legends. Minor skirmishes became epic triumphs. His defeats, and there were defeats, were minimized, explained away, or blamed conveniently on subordinates, on weather, on circumstances beyond his control. He commissioned paintings by the finest artists, showing himself calm and commanding on the battlefield. While chaos raged all around him, Jacques-Louis David's famous portrait of Napoleon crossing the Alps shows him godlike, magnificent, on a rearing white stallion, cape billowing, pointing the way forward. In reality, Napoleon crossed the Alps on a mule, a sensible choice for mountain terrain. But the image, the carefully constructed image, the narrative made visual, mattered infinitely more than the mundane fact, because Napoleon understood what every skilled propagandist throughout history has understood. People remember stories and images, not statistics and facts. A powerful image, repeated often enough, becomes truth in the collective memory, become what people know, what they'll swear actually happened. Napoleon also pioneered, or at least perfected, something that would prove enormously influential in the centuries to come: the cult of personality. He was not just the leader of France, not merely the head of state. He was France. He embodied the nation, the revolution, the destiny of the French people. His image appeared everywhere you looked, on coins, on statue, on public buildings, in every town square, in every government office. To love France was to love Napoleon. To support the empire was to support the emperor. To oppose Napoleon was to oppose France itself. Treason, not merely disagreement. This conflation, this deliberate merging of leader and nation, leader and cause, is a technique that would be used again and again with devastating effect in the centuries to come, by Hitler, by Stalin, by Mao, by countless others throughout the 20th century and beyond. When the leader becomes a symbol, criticism becomes treason, and loyalty becomes not a political choice, not a rational calculation, but a moral imperative, an identity, part of who you are. But it was World War I, the Great War, the war to end all wars, that transformed propaganda from an art practiced by individuals into a science deployed by governments on an industrial scale. For the first time in history, entire nations mobilized completely for total war. Every resource, every person, every aspect of society was directed toward the war effort. And for the first time, governments realized, understood clearly, that industrial scale killing, mechanized slaughter, required something equally powerful. Industrial scale persuasion. Britain, Germany, France, the United States, all created official propaganda bureaus, hired artists, writers, psychologists to craft messages designed to manipulate public opinion. Posters appeared by the millions in every city, every town. Uncle Sam wants you, with his stern face, his pointing finger staring accusingly, from every street corner, every post office, every public building. That image, created by James Montgomery Flagg, became perhaps the most famous recruitment poster ever created. Why did it work so effectively? Because it personalized national duty, not America needs soldiers, which is abstract, distant. But Uncle Sam, a familiar figure, wants you, specifically, personally. The finger points directly at you. You cannot hide. In the crowd, you cannot pretend. Someone else will go instead. The Germans portrayed the Allies as brutal oppressors, as hypocrites, preaching freedom, while maintaining vast empires. The Allies portrayed Germans as barbaric Huns, as monsters, barely human. Atrocity propaganda flourished on both sides. Stories spread like wildfire of German soldiers bayoneting babies, raping nuns, committing unspeakable horrors. Most of these stories were fabrications or wild exaggerations of isolated incidents, but they served a crucial purpose. Why did governments on all sides lie so blatantly, so systematically? Because they understood what we sometimes forget, that modern warfare, total warfare, required the complete commitment, the absolute dedication of entire civilian populations. Men had to enlist, willingly or not. Women had to work in factories producing munitions. Families had to sacrifice, accept rationing, endure loss, cope with grief. And people, ordinary people, will not endure such terrible hardship for abstract concepts, for geopolitical reasons, for territorial disputes that don't directly affect their daily lives. They need an enemy, a monster, something so evil, so threatening, so inhuman, that any sacrifice becomes not just justified, but necessary. This is the terrible power of fear-based propaganda. When people are afraid, truly afraid, deeply afraid, they become remarkably compliant. They accept restrictions on freedom of speech, on freedom of movement, on privacy. They support violence that in peacetime they would find abhorrent. They even sacrifice their own children, sending them to die in distant lands, because the alternative, the monster in the narrative, the enemy as portrayed, seems even worse. Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew, worked on propaganda efforts during World War I. The experience had transformed his understanding of human psychology, of mass persuasion. After the war ended, he realized something profound, that the same techniques, the same psychological principles that had been used to mobilize nations for war could sell anything. Products, ideas, politicians, lifestyles. He effectively invented Modern public relations. His insight was simple but revolutionary. People are not rational actors. They are not driven, primarily, by logic, by careful evaluation of options. They are driven by unconscious desires, by emotions they don't fully understand, by needs for status, for belonging, for identity. Give people what they think they want, what satisfies these unconscious drives, and you can sell them what you actually want to sell. This shift from wartime propaganda to peacetime marketing reveals something deeply unsettling. The techniques are the same, the psychology is identical. Whether you're selling war bonds or breakfast cereal, mobilizing armies or moving merchandise, the fundamental approach remains constant. Understand what people fear, what they desire, what they need to believe about themselves. Then craft a message that speaks to those fears, those desires, those needs, and they will buy what you're selling. They will believe what you want them to believe, not because they're stupid or weak or gullible, but because they're human. The 1930s and 1940s saw propaganda reach its most terrifying form, its most comprehensive application, its most devastating effectiveness. In Nazi Germany, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, controlled absolutely all media, all art, all public expression, all communication. Nothing was published, nothing was broadcast, nothing was performed without approval from the ministry. Goebbels understood intuitively what would later be formalized as a concept of the big lie, a lie so enormous, so audacious, so comprehensive, that people simply cannot believe that anyone would dare to fabricate something so complete, so total. Surely people think, surely there must be some truth to it, because no one would lie about something so fundamental. And in that moment of confusion, of uncertainty, the lie takes root. Hitler's regime blamed Jews systematically, relentlessly, for Germany's economic problems, for the humiliating loss of World War I, for unemployment, for inflation, for every social ill, real or imagined. This scapegoating served multiple crucial purposes. Simultaneously, it unified Germans against a common enemy, an internal enemy, easily identified, easily targeted. It explained complex economic forces, incomprehensible financial systems, global market dynamics, in simple, emotionally satisfying terms. Someone is to blame, someone is responsible, and we know exactly who they are. It also distracted, crucially distracted, from the regime's own failures, its own crimes, its own incompetence. When things go wrong, blame the scapegoat. When things go right, credit the leader. Simple, effective, devastating. The Nazis used radio brilliantly, understanding its power as the first truly mass medium. Hitler's speeches, broadcast across Germany, brought his voice, his ranting passion, his apparent conviction, directly into every home, every apartment, every gathering place. People listened, together, in crowds, reinforcing each other's reactions, their emotional responses. The Nuremberg rallies, with their perfect choreography, their thousands of flags, their blazing torches, their masses of people moving as one, created a sense of overwhelming power, of historical inevitability, of irresistible force. Who could resist such might? Who would even want to? When belonging feels so powerful, so intoxicating, belonging to something larger than yourself, is a deep human need, perhaps the deepest need, after survival itself. The Nazis exploited this need, ruthlessly, brilliantly, creating rituals, symbols, uniforms that made people feel part of something grand, historic, meaningful, something worth dying for, something worth killing for. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's propaganda took a different approach, where the Nazis emphasized emotional spectacle, raw power, tribal belonging. The Soviets emphasized scientific inevitability, historical materialism, the unstoppable march of progress. Marxist-Leninist ideology presented history as a science, with discoverable laws, predictable outcomes. Capitalism would inevitably fall, destroyed by its own contradictions. Communism would inevitably triumph, bringing universal prosperity and justice. This was not opinion, not preference, not hope. This was scientific fact. To oppose the party was not just wrong, morally or politically. It was unscientific. It was like opposing gravity or denying evolution, historically impossible. This narrative gave Soviet propaganda a kind of intellectual weight that appealed strongly to educated people, to intellectuals, to those who wanted to feel that their politics were based on reason, on analysis, on understanding, not mere emotion. Stalin also perfected the art of rewriting history, of controlling the past. Photographs were altered, meticulously retouched, to remove purged officials who had fallen from favor. One day, you stood next to Stalin in an official photo. The next day, after your arrest, you simply disappeared from that same photo, as if you'd never existed. Textbooks were rewritten, constantly updated, to match the current party line. Yesterday's hero became today's traitor. The past became fluid, changeable, malleable, whatever the party said it was. George Orwell captured this brilliantly in his dystopian novel, 1984, with his famous observation: who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. When reality itself can be rewritten, when history changes to suit current needs, resistance becomes almost impossible. Because to resist, you need something solid, something fixed, something unchanging to push against. You need a stable truth. Take that away, make everything fluid, make nothing certain. And people drift, unmoored, accepting whatever they're told. Because what else can they possibly do? After World War II ended, after the ashes settled, the world divided, sharply and seemingly permanently, into two competing systems, two rival ideologies, two incompatible visions of human society. The Cold War began, and while it was sometimes fought with weapons, with proxy wars, with espionage, it was fought more fundamentally, more consistently, with narratives, with propaganda, with competing stories about who we are and what we value. The United States promoted freedom, capitalism, individual rights, private property, personal choice, the American dream, the promise that anyone, through hard work, through determination, could succeed, could prosper, could rise. The Soviet Union promoted equality, collective ownership, liberation from exploitation, freedom from the tyranny of capitalist greed, the promise that everyone would have enough, that none would be left behind, that society would care for all its members. Each side presented itself as the only path, the only viable option, for human flourishing, and each side portrayed the other, not just as wrong, not merely as misguided, but as an existential threat to everything good, everything decent, everything worth preserving. This binary thinking, this stark us versus them mentality, is propaganda's most powerful tool. When people believe, truly believe, that there are only two options, and one is completely unthinkable, completely unacceptable, the other becomes the only choice, no matter its flaws, no matter its failures, no matter what compromises it requires. Better our imperfect system, right, than their monstrous alternative. The Americans used Hollywood brilliantly as a propaganda tool, not through heavy-handed political messaging necessarily, but through lifestyle, through aspiration, through showing the material abundance, the apparent freedom of American life. Movies showed spacious homes, shiny cars, well-stocked supermarkets, happy families, consuming, achieving, succeeding, rock music, jazz, blue jeans, Coca-Cola. These were not just products and entertainment. They were symbols, powerful symbols of a lifestyle, of freedom, of prosperity, of choice, of youth, of rebellion, of possibility. Behind the Iron Curtain, people watched smuggled films, listened to banned music, collected contraband jeans, and dreamed of a different life. The Soviets couldn't compete with this soft power. Their propaganda emphasized sacrifice, duty, collective glory, building the future through present hardship. These are noble ideas, perhaps, but it's remarkably hard to compete with rock music and blue jeans and Coca-Cola. It's hard to make austerity appealing when abundance is visible just across the border. This reveals an important truth about modern propaganda. The most effective propaganda doesn't feel like propaganda. It feels like entertainment, like culture, like freedom, like choice. When people think they're choosing freely, when they believe they're expressing themselves, their authentic selves, they're actually most vulnerable to influence. Because they're not guarding against it, they're not skeptical, they're receptive, open. Both sides also developed elaborate systems of education designed to instill proper ideology from childhood. Soviet children learned about heroic workers and the inevitable triumph of communism. American children pledged allegiance to the flag, learned about founding fathers and American exceptionalism. Both sides taught their children that their system was not just better, but right, morally correct, historically justified. And both sides demonized the other, creating generations who genuinely believed that the enemy was monstrous, barely human, certainly not to be trusted. But then came Vietnam, the first televised war, the first war where images, unfiltered images, uncontrolled images, reached homes across America. Every evening, American families sat down to dinner and watched footage of combat, of burning villages, of wounded soldiers, of body bags lined up on tarmacs. The government's narrative of steady progress, of winning hearts and minds, of imminent victory, clashed violently, horribly, with the images appearing nightly on television screens. For the first time, official propaganda couldn't fully control what people saw, what people knew. The credibility gap widened, becoming a chasm. The government said one thing, the images showed another. People began to question, to doubt, to protest. The anti-war movement grew, using music, using art, using media to spread its own counter-narrative that the war was wrong, unnecessary, immoral, unwinnable. The Pentagon Papers, leaked courageously by Daniel Ellsberg, revealed definitively that the government had lied systematically, comprehensively about the war, its origins, its progress, its prospects. This was a turning point in the history of propaganda, not because governments stopped using it, they didn't, they never will, but because populations, particularly in democracies, became more skeptical, more questioning, more aware that they were being told stories, and that those stories might not reflect reality. The frame became visible. People understood, perhaps for the first time since the printing press, that there were competing narratives, that information could be manipulated, that authority figures could lie, would lie, might be lying right now. This skepticism, this awareness, this critical distance is propaganda's greatest enemy. When people actively question, actively evaluate, actively compare, control becomes much more difficult, which is exactly why modern propaganda has had to evolve, to become far more subtle, far more sophisticated, far more pervasive than anything that came before. Today, right now, at this very moment, we live in an age of unprecedented information access. The internet has democratized the creation and distribution of content, of narrative, of information, of stories. Anyone can publish, anyone can broadcast, anyone can potentially reach millions of people, billions of people with a single post, a single video, a single tweet. This should, in theory, make propaganda impossible. How can you control the narrative when everyone can contribute to it? But instead, paradoxically, it has made propaganda ubiquitous, invisible, and in some ways more effective than ever before. Because in an ocean of information, drowning in data, swimming in content, the truth becomes just another opinion, just another perspective, just another narrative competing for attention. Social media platforms are designed quite deliberately to maximize engagement, to keep you scrolling, to keep you clicking, to keep you on the platform. And what engages us most powerfully, most consistently? Outrage, fear, tribal belonging, content that confirms what we already believe, content that outrages us about the other side, content that makes us feel righteously angry, morally superior, part of the good guys. The algorithms learn remarkably quickly what you click, what you share, what keeps you scrolling, what makes you react, and they feed you more of it, more and more, in an endless stream, not because of conspiracy, not because of a malicious intent necessarily, but because of business models based entirely on capturing and monetizing your attention. The longer you stay, the more ads you see, the more data they collect, the more money will they make. It's that simple and that consequential. We live in filter bubbles, in echo chambers, where our beliefs are constantly reinforced, our biases constantly confirmed, our assumptions constantly validated. We see the version of reality that we've been algorithmically trained to expect, to accept, to defend. Conservatives see one version of events, liberals see another, and increasingly, these versions don't just differ, They're incompatible, describing what seem like different worlds entirely. Modern propaganda doesn't need a ministry of truth, doesn't need centralized control, doesn't need one voice speaking from authority. It simply needs to fragment reality into thousands of competing narratives, into millions of individual bubbles, until people, exhausted, confused, overwhelmed, retreat into the narrative that feels most comfortable, that confirms what they already believe, that makes them feel safe, certain, right. Disinformation campaigns don't need to convince you of a specific lie. They just need to flood the zone with contradictory claims, with competing narratives, with uncertainty, with doubt. The goal is not conviction. The goal is confusion, because confused people, uncertain people, overwhelmed people are easy to manipulate. They're desperate for something, anything that feels solid, that feels true, that feels real. Cambridge Analytica, the now defunct firm that harvested Facebook data from millions of users, understood this perfectly. They created psychographic profiles, detailed psychological portraits of individual voters, and then targeted them with precisely crafted messages designed to trigger specific emotional responses, specific behaviors, specific votes. This is propaganda at the individual level, not a billboard seen by millions delivering one message, but personalized manipulation tailored specifically to you based on your fears, your desires, your psychological vulnerabilities, your browsing history, your likes and shares. And you would never know, never suspect that millions of others were receiving completely different messages about the same candidate, the same issue, the same supposed reality. Each person receiving the message, most likely to move them in the desired direction. This is propaganda, perfected, individualized, invisible, everywhere. And now, right now, we stand at the threshold, the precipice of something even more profound, even more dangerous, even more transformative. Artificial intelligence can now generate images indistinguishable from photographs, videos indistinguishable from reality, audio recordings that perfectly mimic any voice, deepfakes, synthetic media, computational propaganda soon, very soon, perhaps already. By the time you hear this, it will be possible, trivially easy, to create a video of any person saying absolutely anything. Imagine a political leader appearing to confess to crimes they never committed. Imagine a video of violence, of atrocity that never occurred, sparking real-world retaliation, real-world violence. Imagine not being able to trust anything you see, anything you hear, anything that claims to be evidence, proof, reality. The traditional methods of verification, of authentication, are becoming obsolete. Seeing is no longer believing, hearing is no longer knowing. Soon, perhaps very soon, we will live in a world where any image, any video, any audio recording might be synthetic, fabricated, false, indistinguishable from truth. This is the ultimate victory of propaganda, not to convince people of a specific lie, but to make them doubt everything, including the truth. When nothing is certain, when reality itself is negotiable, when you can't trust your own eyes, your own ears. Power belongs to those who control the means of creation, the AI systems, the platforms, the algorithms, and to those who understand that in a world of infinite information, of endless content, of unlimited manipulation, Attention is the only thing, the only scarce resource, that truly matters. But let us step back now, away from technology, away from specific techniques, and return to something more fundamental. Why does propaganda work? Why are we susceptible? What makes human beings intelligent beings, capable of remarkable reasoning, vulnerable to manipulation? The answer lies in the architecture, the evolved structure of the human mind. We are pattern-seeking creatures, meaning-making machines, storytelling animals. We evolved in small tribes where social cohesion, group belonging, meant survival. To be cast out, to be rejected, to be alone, was death. Not metaphorical death, actual death. So we develop powerful instincts, deep psychological drives for conformity, for belonging, for accepting the group's beliefs and the tribe's stories, the collective's reality. These instincts served us well for hundreds of thousands of years in small groups on the African savannah, but in the modern world, they make us vulnerable because propaganda exploits these instincts ruthlessly and effectively. It creates the illusion of consensus. Everyone believes this. Everyone agrees. Everyone knows. To disagree is to be outside the group. We also have a deep need, a profound psychological need for narrative, for stories that explain the chaos, the complexity, the overwhelming randomness of the world. Random events are frightening. Senseless suffering is unbearable. But if there's a story, a pattern, a reason, even a terrible reason, we can cope, we can survive, we can function, even if that reason is wrong, even if that story is false. Better a false certainty than unbearable uncertainty. Propaganda provides easy narratives, simple explanations, clear villains, noble heroes, satisfying conclusions. The world divided into black and white, good and evil, us and them. These narratives are almost always oversimplifications. Reality is complex, nuanced, ambiguous, difficult. But that's precisely why simple narratives work. The human brain, especially under stress, especially under information overload, especially when frightened, seeks simplicity, seeks shortcuts, seeks heuristics, seeks anything that reduces cognitive load. And propaganda is the ultimate shortcut. It tells you what to think, who to trust, who to hate, what to believe. And in return, it offers something priceless: certainty. The feeling that you understand what's happening, that you know what's true, that you're on the right side, the moral side, the winning side. We're all so vulnerable because of confirmation bias, the tendency to seek, to notice, to remember information that confirms what we already believe, and to dismiss, to ignore, to forget information that contradicts our existing worldview. This isn't stupidity, this isn't ignorance. This is how human cognition fundamentally works. We don't see reality objectively, we see reality through the lens of our existing beliefs, our expectations, our needs. Propaganda exploits this by providing exactly the information that confirms what we want to believe, what we need to believe about ourselves, about our group, about our righteousness, about our enemy's evil, as you continue this journey through layers of influence, through mechanisms of control, through the architecture of belief itself. Consider if this resonates deeply, if this knowledge feels valuable. Hitting subscribe ensures you'll continue this education, this awareness, this understanding that so few ever fully grasp, ever fully achieve. Real power, lasting power, lies in understanding the game itself, not just playing it, but seeing it for what it truly is. So what do we do with all this knowledge? How do we protect ourselves, our minds, our beliefs, our autonomy from manipulation? The answer is neither simple nor completely reassuring, because awareness alone, mere knowledge of propaganda, doesn't make us immune, doesn't create a protective shield around our minds. In fact, sometimes, paradoxically, it makes us more vulnerable because we become confident, perhaps overconfident, in our ability to detect manipulation, to see through propaganda, to resist influence. And that confidence, that certainty, that sense of superiority is itself exploitable. The first step, the essential foundation, is humility. Recognizing, truly accepting that we are all susceptible, all vulnerable, all influenced by forces we don't fully understand, that our beliefs, our deepest certainties, our very identity itself may have been shaped, subtly shaped, by propaganda, by manipulation, by narratives that we never consciously chose to believe. This is profoundly uncomfortable. It requires questioning everything, including, especially, the beliefs we hold most dear, the convictions we're most certain about, the identities we've built our entire lives. The second step is actively seeking, diverse perspectives, not just opinions we agree with, not just sources that confirm what we already believe, but views that challenge us, that make us uncomfortable, that force us to reconsider what we think we know, because propaganda thrives, absolutely thrives, in isolation, in homogeneity, in echo chambers, when we only encounter confirming information, supporting data, agreeable perspectives, our worldview becomes rigid, becomes brittle, becomes increasingly disconnected from reality itself. And a rigid worldview, a brittle belief system, is remarkably easy to manipulate by anyone who knows how to speak our language, how to confirm our biases, how to tell us what we want to hear. The third step is understanding, deeply understanding the techniques themselves, recognizing emotional manipulation when it appears, identifying fear-mongering when you see it, noticing scapegoating, blaming convenient targets for complex problems, spotting false binaries, the presentation of only two options when many exist, detecting ad hominem attacks, attacking the person rather than the argument, recognizing appeals to tradition, to novelty, to authority, to popularity. When you can name the technique, when you can identify the mechanism, it loses some of its power, not all its power, not complete immunity, but some resistance, some critical distance, some ability to pause and evaluate before reacting. The fourth step is perhaps the hardest, the most challenging, the most uncomfortable, learning to sit with uncertainty, to say I don't know, and mean it, and be okay with it, to resist the seductive pull, the comforting embrace of simple answers, of easy explanations, of clear certainties, because the world is complex, genuinely complex, maddeningly complex, irreducibly complex, and anyone who claims to have it all figured out, to understand everything, to have simple answers to complex questions, is either lying or profoundly deceived. Neither is trustworthy. True wisdom, genuine understanding, begins with acknowledging how much we don't know, how much we can't know, How much remains? Uncertain, ambiguous, unclear. But with this knowledge comes responsibility, genuine responsibility, because now you understand how minds are shaped, how narratives create reality, how influence operates, how belief is manufactured, how control is maintained. You could use this knowledge ethically, constructively, positively, to communicate more effectively, more honestly, to persuade with integrity, without deception, to inspire genuine positive change, real improvement. Or you could use it to manipulate, to deceive, to control, to exploit others' vulnerabilities for your own benefit. The techniques themselves are morally neutral tools that can be used for any purpose. The morality, the ethics, comes from the intent and the outcome, from whether you're serving people's genuine interests or exploiting their weaknesses. History is full of people, sincere people, convinced people, who believed, genuinely believed that their propaganda was justified, was necessary, was right, that the end, whatever that end was, justified the means, however deceptive those means, that lies in service of a greater truth, a higher purpose, were not just acceptable, but necessary, even noble. Sometimes they were right. Allied propaganda during World War II was often exaggerated, was sometimes false, was certainly manipulative, was definitely unfair. But it served to mobilize populations, to defeat genuine evil, real fascism, actual genocide. Other times, the exact same logic, the identical reasoning, led to catastrophe, led to tyranny, led to oppression, masquerading as liberation. Every authoritarian, every demagogue, every dictator throughout history believed themselves, the hero of their own story, believed their propaganda served a higher purpose, a greater good, a noble cause. The line between persuasion and manipulation, between inspiration and exploitation, between necessary influence and destructive control, is not always clear, is often blurry, is sometimes invisible. But it exists, it matters, it's worth struggling to understand, to identify, to honor. As you lie here now, drifting gently towards sleep, toward rest, consider this: the struggle for control of the human mind, of human belief, of collective consciousness in the is ancient. It predates written language, predates civilization, predates recorded history. It will outlast any current technology, any present system, any contemporary technique, because it is rooted, fundamentally rooted, in something unchangeable about human nature, about how we think, how we connect, how we understand our world. We are social beings, inherently social, unavoidably social. We influence others and are influenced by others. We tell story and we live within story told by others. This cannot change, this will not change, nor should it change. The answer is not to escape all influence, to become completely independent, entirely self-determining. That's impossible and probably undesirable. We are shaped by culture, by language, by every interaction, every relationship, every experience we've ever had. The answer is to be conscious, aware, mindful of the shaping, to choose as much as possible, as much as we're able, the influences we allow into our minds, into our hearts, to strive to be the authors, the primary authors of our own narratives, not passive recipients, not blank canvases, not empty vessels, for narratives written by others, for their purposes. This is the only true freedom in a world of competing propagandas, of endless narratives, of constant influence. The freedom to think critically, independently, courageously, to question, persistently, respectfully, effectively, to remain perpetually curious, perpetually skeptical, perpetually open, to revision, to learning, to growth. And here now, as sleep gently approaches, as consciousness softly fades, there is peace in this, genuine peace, deep peace, in knowing, in accepting that certainty, complete certainty, is often an illusion, a comfortable lie we tell ourselves. That doubt, real doubt, honest doubt, is not weakness, but wisdom. That to say, I might be wrong, is not defeat, not surrender, but strength, intellectual strength, moral strength. The propagandist fears doubt, fears question, fears uncertainty, fears the moment when the frame becomes visible, when the technique becomes apparent, when control slips away. But you now see the frame, understand the techniques, recognize the patterns. You understand that reality is constructed, that narratives compete, that truth is often more complex, more nuanced, more difficult than any simple story. This knowledge doesn't make life easier. In many ways, it makes life harder, more challenging, more demanding, because comfortable certainties are lost. Simple answers no longer satisfy. Easy tribes no longer appeal, but it makes life more honest, more authentic, more genuinely your own. So rest now, ambitious one, thoughtful one, aware one. Let this knowledge settle deeply into your consciousness, into your understanding. Tomorrow you will wake in the same world you fell asleep in, the same systems, the same structures, the same propaganda will still exist, but you will be different, fundamentally different. You will see the patterns, the techniques, the mechanisms, the invisible hands that shape perception, that manufacture consent, that control belief. And in seeing them, truly seeing them, you become harder to control, more difficult to manipulate, more resistant to influence. Not immune. No one is truly immune. No one is completely protected, but aware, vigilant, thoughtful, critical, free in the only way that truly matters, that really counts, free in your mind, in your thoughts, in your beliefs. The empires may rise and fall, as they always have, as they always will. Technologies may transform, may revolutionize, may change everything or nothing. New forms of propaganda will certainly emerge, will definitely evolve, will absolutely appear. But the fundamental game, the essential struggle, remains constant, remains unchanged, remains eternal. The struggle for your attention, for your belief, for your compliance, for your mind. And now you know, you truly know how the game is played, what the rules are, who the players are. Sleep with that power, that knowledge, that awareness. Dream of a world, a better world, a different world, where more people see the frame, where narratives are questioned, where truth matters more than convenience, than comfort, than certainty. That world begins with you, with your awareness, with your refusal, your absolute refusal to be anyone's puppet, anyone's tool, anyone's unwitting agent. Rest now, knowing that knowledge, genuine knowledge, deep knowledge, is the first essential step toward freedom, toward autonomy, toward genuine choice and freedom, even when imperfect, even when partial, even when challenging, is always worth the struggle, worth the effort, worth the discomfort. The story of propaganda, the long story, is not over, will never be over. It continues, it evolves, it adapts. As long as humans communicate, as long as we influence, as long as we persuade, propaganda, in some form, will exist. But you now are no longer merely a passive character in someone else's story, in someone else's narrative. You are the author, the primary author of your own story. Write it wisely, write it consciously, write it freely. Sleep deeply now, rest completely, recover fully. Wake empowered, wake aware, wake free. The evolution of propaganda continues, endlessly continues, perpetually continues. But so does the evolution of awareness, of understanding, of resistance. And awareness, ultimately, is the only force powerful enough, subtle enough, persistent enough to resist the ancient architecture of control. Good night, ambitious one. May your dreams be truly your own, genuinely your own, authentically your own. May you wake with clarity, with purpose, with power, the power that comes from understanding, from awareness, from knowledge. Rest now.